All right, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Klaus Miczek, esteemed professor in psychology at Tufts University and the longtime editor of the journal Psychopharmacology. Welcome, Dr. Miczek.
Hi, yes, I have started my career in psychopharmacology in 1975 by joining the editorial board. At that time, the editor-in-chief was Herbert Berry III, who is still alive and with whom I still have contact. And his counterpart in Europe was Trevor Robbins, who is still with the journal at this present time. So Trevor Robbins was a junior member of the Cambridge University psychology department at the time, and he's now, of course, the chair and the director.
Yeah, so it's really amazing. Of almost a 40-year career at this journal. You must really have a strong feeling towards this journal to have worked with them for so very long. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely correct. My very first paper that I submitted to Psychopharmacology was, of course, rejected. So I had a very humble beginning. The reviewer said, this young whippersnapper should be consulting the literature. And I got quite a lesson on my very first submission.
Wow, I'm sure many of the audience here will be able to relate to that, although not with you as editor, I'm sure.
Yeah, we always had a very interesting relationship. Trevor and me got together every year and we compared notes, and we're entertained by the idea that some authors thought Trevor is really a hard reviewer and editor, and Klaus is such a nice guy, and vice versa. People would say, oh, Klaus is the toughest cookie and Trevor is the easy one. And when we compared notes, we were right on the money on every case. We never had an exception.
Wow, that's amazing. It's a sign of a really strong editorial group, which is something that I, as a relatively junior scientist, have certainly noticed with you, Trevor, and others as editors over the years. Really one of my favorite journals to send my papers to.
We do a good job in interacting with authors. The goal is always to make the piece more attractive, more readable, more impactful. And I think those are the guidelines that we are really following, helping the authors rather than antagonizing them.
Absolutely, I've noticed that on my side as well. In fact, I remember sending a paper to you and you doing such a thorough editorial review as the senior editor on this paper, giving me a detailed list of comments as well as a suggested change for the phrasing of the title, and also a suggestion of that I should get a book that you recommended. Perhaps you can come up with the name. I can't at the moment. About like how to write a scientific paper, basically. So, you know, I learned a lot from you, both directly and indirectly in this way.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm a big fan of the book that you're referring to by Robert J. Day, How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper. It's in several editions and there are very similar books now available, but I liked it a lot because it told people how to write a title, how to write an abstract, how to write an introduction, how to write a method section, how to really do a good job on the key results and eventually the discussion. And it also made comments about the graphs, how to portray your data most advantageously. And I still like that book. Robert J. Day, How to Write. It's a pamphlet. It's not really a serious big book, but I think that makes the paper much better.
Yep, I would agree. I'll put a link to this in the thread here in case any junior scientists would like to receive the same wisdom I was able to as well. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, you said you started at the journal in 1975, almost 40 years ago at this point. What was the journal like when you first got there as editor?
The big problem was that it was an old white men affair. And the first thing that I did is get a really competent, good review, principal editor, reviewing editor onto the board, who was actually a woman. And that turned out to be a really good first step. And as a matter of fact, right now, when I 2 years ago disengaged officially, the publisher asked me whom to recommend as a follower, and I immediately jumped on. For 2 years, I courted Trisha Janek, who took over as coordinating editor, and we have Christelle Bonnes from Marseille. We did very well. Now I would say 40 years later or 45 years later, I would say it's 50-50. So that was my first task, to get a little bit the imbalance going. And we had wonderful, really very highly competent female authors, editors, reviewers. I'm extremely satisfied with that development.
Yeah, that's really a fantastic aspect of the journal's editorial board. We have a diverse group of outstanding editors who really are the tops in their field.
Yeah.
All the ones you just mentioned, for example, as well as Harriet DeWitt, who was my former mentor as well. And I think I may have published a paper or two with her as well in the journal.
She was the very first person I appointed. And I have been happy with that ever since.
Fantastic. What would you say is your most important impact that you've made in your time in the journal's leadership? Perhaps you've already mentioned it, but if there's anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, definitely. Trevor and me got together and decided we can do an attractive job on the journal by grouping articles together that had a relationship with each other. In other words, this was the beginning of special issues. This was the beginning of, and we did 30 of them. So it's not something that we just did passingly, but every year we got together and collected articles that belong together. And eventually we made a call for special issues. So the special issue was one of the elements that we both contributed to. And by the end, I think Trevor and me edited at least 30 some special issues. We also expanded that by inviting very promising young authors to write review articles that were the key to the special issue. And that worked out very well too. Turns out our competitors do the same thing now. So that's probably the best compliment. That if something works for one journal, why shouldn't it work for another journal? And that's right now a critical phase for the journal, because psychopharmacology and neuropsychopharmacology are produced by the same outfit, Springer Nature. And they have to figure out how to rearrange themselves. Who will publish what? Right now, the neuropsychopharmacology has the nose in front. It's a little bit better, but not much than psychopharmacology. They're oftentimes on equal par, but neuropsychopharmacology, of course, is driven by ACNP, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. So it's a completely different outfit, has a hierarchical structure, whereas the people who run psychopharmacology is much more of a democracy. We get together and we agree sometimes we disagree, but not often, and settle things for the journal in general. We look at the statistics, we look at the metrics, and well, I don't do that anymore, but I used to every year. And that was another nice feature. ACNP gets together once a year in December. Psychopharmacology doesn't really have that connection until very recently, when the European Behavioral Pharmacology Society became the journal of choice. And that relationship has to grow and maybe morph into more neuro direction. But that's my personal opinion.
Very interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the relationship there, since you brought up ACNP and neuropsychopharmacology. And it kind of brings me into my next question. How would you like to see the journal change over the next coming years? If you, obviously you stepped down now formally, but we'd love to hear your opinion. And I'm assuming the next generation of leaders as well of the journal would like to hear that as well.
Well, the field has morphed, and you cannot really dissociate yourself from that. In the old days, it was a drug effect on some behavioral measure. And there were studies on anxiolytics, there were studies on antipsychotics, there were studies on antidepressants, and of course, a lot of drug abuse research. And those were the sort of the big themes. Nowadays, people want to know more. I want to know more. I want to know, what is the mechanism of this drug action? So at the minimum, I would say receptor pharmacology is foremost, but also network pharmacology is foremost. And that's a really good development. But that's an indirect competition with neuropsychopharmacology. But competition isn't bad. There are some mistakes, but by and large, it's a good force. It makes people do better work. If you know you're ahead against other articles in this area, you do a better job. There are many flowers in that garden, and one of the flowers is, of course, biological psychiatry, which has also an edge. And another developmental area is the translational relationship between clinical articles, preclinical articles, and reverse. So that the phenomena that clinicians have to confront every day can be studied in animal models with some profit, and you have to really pay attention to develop really good models that really work, not just established model systems that we know have problems. So that's a tough task. But
it sure is, yeah.
But I'm very confident that the editorial board right now has exactly the people who are along that line. It could grow a little bit more into the clinical area. It's reasonably balanced, but it could be better.
Yeah, perhaps I think very newly, recently announced new editor in North American clinical psychopharmacology, Diego Pizzagalli, may make some steps towards this this pursuit as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so you yourself, obviously have not just been the editor of this journal, but have been a very active behavioral neuroscientist as well for just as long, if not longer. And you've published dozens of papers from your own lab in the journal. Is there any of these papers that you'd like to sort of highlight in this format?
Absolutely. Thank you for giving me the chance. I'm submitting a paper hopefully this week, which I really like a lot. because it's something that I always thought about, but never did anything about it. And it's about decision-making in the prefrontal cortex. And it's decision-making about social choices. And that's an area, I mean, decision-making has been studied many times for a long period of times. And it is a big item in clinical research, but the animal model that I'm proposing and putting forward is basically making a choice between pro-social and antisocial behavior. And that has never been accomplished in animals. So I like that idea a lot. And it's something that is brand new for me. I have never done an experiment like that before. And the reviewers liked it. That was the important part. The one reviewer was gushing over it and said, brand new stuff. And, the older you get more into the rut of doing the same thing over and over again. And I hope I have broken that rut. Mm-hmm. So that's one area. I can make also some comments about which articles succeeded and which articles failed.
Fantastic.
And the most successful articles I managed to get into the journal were in a special issue, review articles. So review articles really, really help a lot, particularly for junior faculty and grad students and postdocs, of course. Because review articles can be very, very influential. And so I had a 2002 article, which is way up in the citation history. And but my really very original article that I maybe mentioned goes back 50 years. And it was the establishment of a method. And methods papers are not glamorous papers, but they're very useful. And everybody goes back to them and says, how did they actually do this? And that's useful. Having a useful contribution gets you cited again and again and again. And up to today, 40 years later, that methods papers are still cited hundreds of times. So that's one area, methods papers. And that's how I started out, developing new methods. And the second one is the review article. They're most influential and referred to again and again. When you compare it to the high intensity papers that are, blows the roof of the head, that's basically a short-lived phenomenon. The first 5-10 years, yes, and then they taper off. I had one paper that wasn't published in Psychopharmacology that we submitted to fancy neuroscience journals and was rejected all the way around. It was cited once or twice in the first 2 years, a total disaster. And it was, however, a paper with a new method, and neurochemistry method. And it was immediately questioned and rejected at all the major journals. We finally got it published. It wasn't cited very much at all in the beginning. You couldn't have built your career on it if you wanted to, because it was basically ignored. There were 1 or 2 or 3 citations, and that was it. And now, that's why I tell the story, it is my most frequently cited paper 30 years later. And it was based on a dissertation research by a wonderful junior colleague who became a very successful scientist and is now even a dean. Maybe she can get me a job.
Wow, what is her name, by the way?
Her name is Jennifer Tidy. She's at Brown University. She was part of a cohort of students that I am extremely admiring because they did extremely well in their careers. At Columbia, at Hopkins, and at Brown, they did very well. Maybe better than I did.
I'm sure your mentorship was a big part of their success, as I know that certainly to whatever success I've had is hugely due to my mentors as well. Perhaps I could even consider you one of those as a writing mentor at least. And then you've already given some fantastic advice to junior scientists. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you have any other advice that you'd like to give the next generation, the people that will be seeing this perhaps on Twitter, maybe considering psychopharmacology as a journal for their own papers or just careers in science. Is there anything you'd like to tell those scientists?
I'm obviously biased towards psychopharmacology, although I have, also spread my submissions to neuropsychopharmacology with colleagues together. And one of the people at neuropsychopharmacology is actually the editor-in-chief, and he's only 20 minutes away from me at McLean Hospital. So we got together, we published together in neuropsychopharmacology, and he also published in psychopharmacology.
This is Bill Carlson you're talking about, right?
Absolutely, correct. And I think his term is also coming towards an end, and there will be a new person, but he really did a good job in bringing neuropsychopharmacology in the forefront. But as I said, competition isn't bad. I still remember going to an ACNP meeting many, many years ago and talking to Oakley Ray, who ran the association for many decades, and entertaining with him the possibility of incorporating neuropsychopharmacology into psychopharmacology, which he, of course, roundly rejected, and probably to his advantage. But I tried. And we had a very unusual governance of psychopharmacology. It was in the old days just Trevor and me getting together with the publisher representative for a dinner in Cambridge or in Heidelberg, and that was it. And then when the individual who represented the publisher became more involved, he invited the whole board, and that created camaraderie. We all were on the same table, very different areas of research, but we got together for a nice Heidelberg dinner and enjoyed this very much, this gathering. So that doesn't happen at neuropsychopharm. There's much more competitive behavior. Psychopharm is much more of a friendly interaction. So it's a different climate and a different atmosphere. And I think that should be emphasized, that psychopharm has more of a collegial approach rather than a competitive approach. You can argue both sides. You can say competition is good. You can say collegiality is good. I think both are good.
Yep, and I think both journals are good. So this is there's room for everybody, and I'm excited to see how these journals develop, especially now under the same publisher, and now that they're both sort of associated with a organization, scientific organization as well. Should be really interesting to see how Psychopharm develops. I'm sure we're looking forward to really good things with the amazing crop of leadership that we currently have at the journal. You pointed out.
I agree.
And none of this would have been possible without your, just really formidable leadership for the journal, obviously, for the field as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Miczek, for sharing your thoughts here today. I think you really, it's just fascinating to hear your perspective and hear what you have to say about both the past, the present, and the future of our journal, Psychopharmacology.
Sounds excellent.
Thank you
for
again.
giving me the opportunity.
It was my pleasure entirely. Have a great day.
You too.